The fast set antler mache we put over our block to hold it in place has now set up. So we need to just finish sand it so it has a nice smooth transition into our carved body. I'm going to take a little bit of water, just put it on it. Take our drywall sanding screen. Just sand from head to tail. We're just smoothing it out. And that's done. And then what we'll do now is we'll just take a little bit of water from the sink and just spray off any excess right before we mount. Also, on the bass, we took that over to the sink and we just sprayed off all that extra mache that was on the cheek. And made sure it was plenty clean in here. Sometimes that mache can leak through and in, and that'll get in the way of our mounting process. So the bass is ready to mount. The next step is to take the bass body over to the sink, clean this off, and make sure the entire body is wet. We're back from the sink. We sprayed off all the extra antler set mache on the back, and we just have a nice moist form now. We just put a little mist of cold water on that. The fish has been cleaned off and it's ready for mounting. The first step in mounting is we have to sew up the esophagus. If you recall, we had cut it off like this where it went into the gut. So we need to close that off so you're not going to be seeing foam when you're looking into the mouth after it's mounted. To do that, we're going to use 6-pound test fishing line. This is also what we're going to use to sew our fish up. This is a Glover's needle. You can get this from Mackenzie out of the Van Dyke's catalog. This works great for all sizes of fish. And if you're going to get into fish in a big way, make sure you have a lot of these around because they get lost easily. Sometimes when you get these in, you also have to sharpen them a little bit. They can be a little dull. I just do a couple half knots in that. We're just going to go do like basically a baseball stitch knot. Okay, we bring the first one through and we're just going to tie that off with a couple of half knots. We're going to keep our spacing at about 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch apart as we move up towards the top of the esophagus up here. If there are a few little gaps and holes, that's okay. We're going to fix those at the end with epoxy. It's almost impossible to get this extremely neat during this process, so we don't even bother. We just wanted to have it closed up. Also, if this isn't closed up, some of your maches from your mounting process can migrate into the mouth and be difficult to get out later. Okay, now we're at the top. We're going to do a stitch. We actually go inside of our loop 3 times. I'm going to pull that tight. Cut off the tag ends. The esophagus has been closed. Cut off the excess line on our needle. Now we have to put the maches into our bass. As you recall, we had mixed up 2 kinds of maches. One of them is our glue mix, or the soft mix, and the other is the harder mix, which is going to give us stability in the fin roots and in the head. We're going to start by just dabbing the moisture off of the bass skin. These are just paper towels. You don't want to have it super dry, but you don't want any puddles of water in here. Okay, now we're going to take our harder mix of mache. We're going to put a small amount right at the anal fin. This is at the show side, this area here. We do this to rebuild some of that muscle detail that we removed. Even though that's been carved into the form, we didn't carve enough into the form every time. So we always want to put a little bit of extra right here just to accent that. You can put it on both sides if you want. I normally just put it on the show side. I'm going to put a little bit on the soft dorsal. Going to put a little bit right at the pectoral fin to rebuild that muscle detail. A very small amount at the pelvic fins. inside the cavity of the head, I'm going to put a fairly large amount. It's not golf ball size, but maybe half the size of a golf ball. We're going to put it in and we're just going to spread it out, pushing it against the skin in a U shape, so it's just covering everything. That's where our top of our form is going to sit against that. That helps to give us a smooth transition between the scaled skin and the actual head of the bass. The little bit of dextrin we put in is what's going to actually help to hold that in place. Now we're going to put a little bit at the tail juncture. We're just spreading it in. We don't want a lot here at this point. Just enough to seat it in. As you can see here, you can always add more in later, but I like to start with about that much. Now we have to put our glue on. There's two ways we can do that. We can put the glue on the form, or we can put the glue on the skin, or you can do both. Today we're actually just going to put our glue directly on the skin to show you everywhere it needs to go. Basically, the entire inside of the skin needs to be covered with our glue mix. You can see how gluey and sticky that is. We're just going to start rubbing that in. In this membrane area, make sure we get quite a bit up into the throat latch. You don't want too much. You want just a thin layer. If you get too much on here at one time, it can start getting lumpy on you after you have the fish mounted. We don't want that. If you have an area that has very bad scales, like on the belly, you can put a little bit extra in there and that'll actually help to seat that area in. Some of this will actually get spread out a little bit better too during the mounting process. I think we have pretty much 100% coverage. And we're going to take some of the mache off our hands. I like to keep a water bucket right next to me when I'm mounting, or a sink. Either one's fine. You don't want to have a big buildup of mache on you when you're handling the fish. Now we need to put some paper towels underneath the fish to act as a cradle for our body when we're mounting it. You want to use quite a few paper towels for this. Kind of fold them up into a ball. Lift up the skin, put it underneath. Now when we're actually mounting the fish and we're pressing down, we're not accidentally going to break the tail. If you do recall, we did put a wire in it as well. You can see how we have the form seated into the head. This is just our initial seating in. We'll tweak it in a little bit. You can see how our tail juncture lines up. I just kind of pressed the paper towels down a little bit so this would come into my mache. I'm going to put a little bit more mache over that tail juncture right now. We can add more and shape that more later. That just is going to help hold everything in place. So now we actually start bringing our skin around the fish body we carved. I like to start right at the anal fin, getting that belly and that anal fin aligned. Come down on the caudal peduncle region and pull that up, make sure that's in its correct position. Come up here by the pelvic fins, start pulling that skin around, putting it into position. We go on the top, make sure the dorsal is in position, both the soft and spiny. Pull the skin around by the peduncle. Finish off by opening the mouth and kind of seating that bone right against our form, like that. Before we start sewing, we're actually going to flip the fish over. just to make sure all of our alignment points are correct. You can see here I need to bring my soft dorsal back a little bit. I'm just going to pull that back into position. Just make sure all my fins are aligning correctly, including my tail. Open up the mouth. That looks good. We have good alignment here. Another thing you can do is hold it up like this and see where you're at. And we're almost right in the center. We're a little bit towards your show side, and that's fine because we haven't done any sewing yet. When we get done sewing, that will actually pull it back almost to the exact position. Same with the pec fins. The pec fins are just slightly towards the show side, and that's perfect at this point. You wouldn't want them to be in exact position yet. Okay, now that everything is basically lined up, we can actually start sewing the fish. I'm always realigning, making sure everything is lining up properly. You cannot do that enough. Now we need to start sewing the bass. As you can see, the seam looks like it might be a little bit big at this point. What you'll see is after we get done sewing and pulling that string 3 times, it's going to come in tremendously. It actually come in almost a full inch. So we'll have a seam that's running right like this, which is almost a perfect seam. Again, we're going to be using 6-pound test Stren fishing line to do this. Again, this is our Glover's needle. We're just going to do a few half knots. Okay, I like to keep my string off the workbench so I know where it is. I'm going to start right here. This is at the end of the caudal peduncle, and we're going to go right in that skin. Pull our line through. We're going to do a couple of half knots just to hold that in place. Trim off the excess. We're going to be doing just over and under stitches. We do not want to pull this line tight at this point. Looser the better. We'll tighten it as we go. In this section here, you never pull this line tight right at the end. It'll bunch this tail up. So again, as we're sewing here, do not think you need to be pulling on this to get it tight. You want it loose. That actually gives us some ability to taxi the skin around on the show side of the fish after we have the initial sewing completed. And the distance between my stitches here is about 1/4 of an inch. You can make them a little closer if you want. Even a little wider is okay. Down by the tail here, you want to have them closer together than as you get up in the midsection of the fish. Some fish are harder to sew through than others. Bass are fairly easy. Some spawning fish are very thick here by the peduncle region. You have to make sure you have a very sharp needle. Also, some fish have very delicate skin that is easily tears, and as you put your stitches in, if you pull it too tight in any one spot, it'll actually just rip out. And in that case, you'd have to come onto the body a little bit more with your stitching. A lot of people actually staple their fish. There are a number of problems with that. One of them is you cannot continuously go back and adjust by pulling your stitches. Also, if you carve your own forms, you cannot staple into these. You'd have to make a line of Bondo here to try to staple into. Sewing is definitely the best way. We've been sewing up fish here for over 40 years, and it's always worked out excellent for us. This area here is always kind of a tight area. Things like to bunch up right in here. So I like to keep my stitches just a little bit closer, so as I go through the pulling of my stitches process, I have more control through this area. As we get near the belly, the skin does get a little weaker. So we're going to start to go in a little bit further with our stitches. Okay, you can see how that skin is coming over our block nicely. As we pull this skin in even further, you're going to see that continue. And that actually helps to hold the block in along with our antler set mache. See, we're just moving up to the head. Come to the area we had originally cut those cleithrium bones out. You want to come to the point you're about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch away from the end. And the rest of the way we'll pin if there's a few areas there. That's the initial sewing. The next step is to actually flip this bass over and see how we came out. It's starting to look like a largemouth bass now. So I'm actually going to be taking my hand and I'm just smoothing out that glue mache that's against the form right underneath the skin. Make sure there's no lumps in it. I'm just shaping everything, shaping the fin junctures. I'm pushing some of that mache and air bubbles out of the skin. You can actually push a lot of them out around the tail region. That's an open area. You can also push them out by the vent. You can see some bubbles come out there when I did that. Sure, my pelvic fins are aligned. So I want to make sure that my pectoral fin is aligning in the correct groove, and it is. You can see here, it's kind of hard to see, but the cleithrium bones are sitting in that little notch we carved nicely. Go ahead and open up the mouth on the bass again. Make sure our head juncture is still in line, and it is. This bass actually has quite a large head for the body size, which is common on a lot of bass. You will see that. When that happens, you want to make sure you carve your form a little taller here than you normally would to accommodate for that. That's again another reason why when we actually do our tracing, we have the mouth propped open. So everything's looking good here. We can flip it back around. We can take our hands and start pushing up towards that seam. We're going to be pushing air bubbles out, and we're pushing that glue mix out, that if there's any excess. A lot of times air bubbles like to get caught around the vent and the anal fin, so we're just pushing that out. Also up at the soft dorsal. We make sure the throat latch is coming together nicely, and it is. You can take a look in here, and you can just make sure that our form is seating right up against the top of the head bone, and it is. Right there where my finger is, that's where the form is stopping. If your form is too long up here, it'll actually push the head down. If that happens after you already have it sewed up, you can take your fish skin knife and cut a little bit of the foam out right through here. Now that we have our initial sewing complete and we have turned the fish over and looked at everything to make sure we're aligned correctly, we are going to start our first pulling of the stitches. Again, we do not want to pull down here to start. We want to leave this loose. We're going to start right here. This is just a sculpting tool you can get from Headquarters Taxidermy Supply. Works great for this, but you can use anything for this. As long as it doesn't have a sharp edge, you don't want to cut your line. So again, we're not going to pull extremely tight here. We just want to get some of the play out with this first pull. See how I'm working along? I'm holding it with the other hand as I'm moving up the fish. We get near the head, you can just pull it fairly tight. We flip it back around one more time. Just again, make sure there's no air bubbles between the skin and the form. Make sure that that hide glue we put on, or hide paste, is evenly spread out. I'm just kind of feeling with my hand to make sure that it's completely been spread out. I'm shaping that mache we put in the anal fin and in the soft dorsal. That's cooperating nicely. Sometimes you get air bubbles right here where it's starting to sweep up, and I'm just pushing those out with my thumb. Making sure the tail's still lining correctly. We check our pelvic fins to make sure they're seating correctly, and they are. And we check our pectoral fin, and that is also sitting correctly. Open the mouth one more time, and everything is lining up correctly there. So we're ready to do another pull. Flip it back around on top of our paper towels. You can pull a little bit tighter this time. And we're going to start here. Work our way towards the head. You can see our seams coming together very nicely now. This is our final check over on the show side. Same things we checked for before. No air bubbles, everything's nice and smooth. Things looking really good. At this point you can actually hold it up, start looking at that body, making sure everything's lining up and looking nice, and it definitely is on this one. Just bringing any air bubbles or any extra mache towards that seam. This is our final pull. You can pull it fairly tight, but not tight enough that you're actually going to break your fishing line. And that's it for sewing it. So we got a very nice seam here. I call this a commercial seam. If you wanted to bring that seam closer, you could take a little bit more foam down, but I wouldn't recommend it. If you give the customer a bass with a seam like this, it's going to be just a little bit bigger than what he caught. It doesn't jeopardize any of the anatomy, as you saw what we checked for, and it just looks a little bit bigger. We had a nice deep looking bass here. So the next thing we have to do is tie off our fishing line. I'm going to grab a T-pin for that, push it in the foam, wrap it around it a number of times, push it in, just cut off that extra line. Grab my needle right now and set it aside so I don't lose it. They're very easy to lose in a fish shop. Okay. Now we are going to take 1-inch bank pins, and we're going to go up around the top of the head through here. This is where the cleithrium bone was. I'm going to kind of put the head into the mounted position. I'm just going to pin that skin right into the foam. You can use just 2 or 3 pins to do it up here. We don't want to pin it super tight up here yet where my finger is. Okay, same down here. This is the lower part of the cleithrium. Just pinning the skin in. This is where the pectoral fin was that we removed when we did our initial skinning. And we're going to just pin this throat latch skin in. We don't want to take this skin and pull it this way. We want to just bring it up to the foam and pin it in, because otherwise it can distort the head. Now we flip him back over. Looks like a nice bass. I'm going to put one pin right here where the cleithrium bone is and the pectoral fin. It's going to help hold that in place. You can also put one pin right at the pelvic fins if you feel you need it. I'm going to put one there just to help hold that alignment. At this time we also check our tail. Make sure we have enough mache in it. Sometimes that can fall out. the original amount we put in, and it looks like we're all there and still in good shape. We can add a little bit more even after we start the finished mounting process. We open up the mouth on the bass. Again, make sure everything is looking good. We have good alignment everywhere. We just need to put our mache mix now into the front cheek. Now this is different than what we put in the back cheek. The back cheek, we put the fast set antler mache. In this, we're just going to put our normal set mache. There might be a little bit of meat right here yet, so I'm going to grab that and get rid of that. Now is the time to always get rid of that. Otherwise that can dry in there and it'll distort your actual cheek. Make it look like there's actually a depression there. So I'm just going to push this machine in with my finger. I'm going to puff it up a little bit more than I normally would to start, and then I'm going to flatten it. So you want to make sure you have it adequately pushed in, so it's all the way down into all these edges. If you don't push it down into these edges, they will not dry correctly. It'll look lumpy here and shrunken in right here. Again, I'm just pushing it back into all of the edges of that cavity. Okay, right now it's puffed up a little bit more than it should be, so I'm just going to smooth it out. Should be fairly flat. And you look at reference of bass, or even this bass before we skinned it, you'll see what I'm talking about. Okay, now we're just going to look under our gill cover, make sure we don't have to do any pinning there. We don't. So this fish is now ready to get this excess mache all washed off of it so we can start the finish mounting process. Now you can do that with water you have at your bench. I actually like to take it over to the sink and just spray it off. So I'm going to go run over to the sink, spray this off, and come back and we'll get it finished mounted.